Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Manzikert, 1071. The sun burns low over the Anatolian plateau. The land, also known historically as Asia Minor, is dry, ancient, brittle, with the dust of forgotten empires. Cicadas sing their rasping hymn in the olive groves, and the wind carries the scent of sage and blood. In the distance, the black shape of Mount Ararat looms like a god, watching over the borderlands of east and west. It is the summer of 1071, and the world is about to tilt. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire had endured, bloodied, besieged, but still standing. It called itself Romaioi, the true heirs of Rome. A bridge between civilizations. Greek in culture, Roman in law, Christian in soul. At its height, it spanned from Italy to the Holy Land, from the Nile to the Danube. Its walls were thick, its cities golden, its legacy unquestioned. But by the 11th century, that legacy was crumbling. The old glories were gone. The empire now teetered, hollowed by internal strife, weakened by civil war and strangled by the rise of new powers on every side. Normans in the west, Pechenegs in the north, and to the east, something far more dangerous, a rising force from the steppes. The Seljuk Turks. They were swift, lean, fierce. A warrior people forged in the harsh crucible of Central Asia, descended from Oghuz Turkic nomads, hardened by life on horseback and sharpened by Islam. Where the Byzantines marched with banners and siege engines, the Seljuks rode with speed and precision, loosing arrows from the saddle at full gallop. They had no need for walls, they were the storm that blew through them. Under the brilliant leadership of Alp Arslan, the lion hero, the Seljuks had swept westward like fire across dry grass. Persia had fallen. Baghdad was theirs. The Caliph bowed to their might, and now their eyes turned to Anatolia, the Byzantine heartland. For the Seljuks, it was more than conquest. It was destiny, the spread of Islam, the taming of infidels, the founding of a new order. Desperate to hold back the tide, the Byzantines turned to one man, Romanos IV Diogenes, a soldier emperor, tall, charismatic, proud, not born into the throne but married into it, a marriage of political convenience, not love. He was seen as a usurper by many in Constantinople, but he was bold, and the empire needed boldness. In 1071, Romanos gathered an army, one of the largest Byzantium had fielded in years. It was a patchwork host. Byzantines, yes, but also Armenian levies, Frankish knights, Slavic mercenaries, Pecheneg horsemen, Varangian guards from the north, even a contingent of Normans. The full ragtag diversity of a crumbling empire on the brink. Romanos's goal was simple, if dangerously ambitious. He would march east, strike deep into Seljuk-held territory, and force a decisive confrontation. A hammer blow that would remind the world that Byzantium still had teeth. But what he didn't know was that he was walking into a trap. The Byzantine army moved slowly, through Cappadocia, across the Euphrates, eastward toward the fortress city of Manzikert, a strategic outpost near Lake Van. It was old Armenian country, a land of mountains, gorges and hidden valleys, hard terrain for an invading host, worse for coordination. On paper, Romanos had over 40,000 men, but the cracks were already showing. There was disunity in the command structure, feuds between generals, distrust between ethnic factions, and most fatally, treachery. One of his subordinate commanders was Andronikos Doukas, son of the powerful Doukas family, bitter rivals of Romanos. He'd been forced to serve under the emperor, but his loyalty was poisoned with ambition. In late August, Romanos split his army in two. A fatal decision. He sent one column under General Joseph Tarchaneots to take the nearby fortress of Kliat, hoping to secure his flanks. That force would vanish, never arriving, never seen again. Some say they were ambushed, others say they deserted. With his strength halved and his flank exposed, Romanos pressed on to Manzikert, unaware that Alp Arslan and a massive Seljuk force were already in the area, watching. Still, the city fell quickly. The Byzantines raised their banners over the walls, but it was a hollow victory. The Seljuks had no intention of holding ground. They were already in motion, riding in wide arcs, probing, surrounding, cutting off supply lines. And from the high ridges, the horns began to sound. Alp Arslan had not expected to face a Byzantine invasion. He'd been campaigning in Syria, when news reached him of the advancing Romanos. In a matter of weeks, he turned his entire army around and raced north, covering impossible distances with terrifying speed. By the time Romanos reached Manzikert, the Seljuks were already there, hidden in the hills, moving like shadows. Alp Arslan was a master of steppe warfare. He didn't fight like the Byzantines, no siege towers, no formal engagements. His strength lay in mobility, deception, and timing. He sent envoys to Romanos, offering peace terms. Romanos, confident in his numbers, refused. The trap was now fully set. August 26th, 1071. It was to be the first day of battle, and it was a clear, blistering afternoon. The Byzantine army drew up west of Manzikert in classic formation, heavy infantry in the centre, cavalry on the flanks, archers behind. The Varangians, towering Norse warriors with axes the size of men, stood at the emperor's side, glittering in chainmail. Across the plain, the Seljuks seemed to melt into the terrain. At first, there was no full engagement and just arrows, endless waves of them, fired from horseback with deadly precision. The Seljuk riders would dart in close, release a volley, then peel away before the Byzantines could counter. The sound was relentless. The twang of bowstrings, the scream of horses, the cries of dying men, shields thudded under impact. Men clutched at feathered shafts embedded in flesh, and still the Seljuks refused to engage directly. It was psychological warfare. Death by 1,000 cuts. Romanos tried to press forward, to pin the Seljuks down, but every time his forces advanced, the Turks withdrew, drawing them out further, breaking cohesion. Dust rose like smoke. Communication faltered. Units became isolated. There was no clear enemy line to strike, only ghosts on horseback, always just out of reach. By late afternoon, with morale faltering and exhaustion setting in, Romanos ordered a general retreat, a move that required perfect discipline. He would not get it. As the Byzantine centre began to fall back, Alp Arslan struck. It happened like lightning. The Seljuk horsemen wheeled around, formed into a crescent, and closed the trap. Arrows rained down. The flanks collapsed. Panic took hold. Pechenegs fled. Armenians broke. The Franks fought desperately, then were swallowed. And in the chaos, treachery. Andronikos Doukas, guarding the rear, saw his chance. Instead of supporting the retreat, he turned his troops and fled the field entirely, sealing the doom of the emperor. The centre was encircled. The Varangians formed a shield wall, buying time. They were the last wall between the emperor and oblivion, the Varangian Guard. Axe-bearers of the empire, men from the cold lands of the north, taller and broader than most Byzantines, bound by oath and gold to fight until their contract, or their lives, ran out. On that plain at Manzikert, their curved two-handed axes caught the late sun, steel flashing through the dust like the wings of a hawk in the dive. Their armour was a patchwork of worlds, long mail hauberks that hung to the knee, sewn with scales or plates in places most likely to take a blow. The iron was darkened with age and use, nicked and battered from battles fought far from Anatolia. Over their shoulders, heavy cloaks of wool or fur marked them as men from the colder north, a small comfort against the biting steppe winds. But it was the axes that made them feared. Each one was a slab of iron, curved in a broad crescent, fixed to a shaft as long as a man's arm. The heads were polished to a dull gleam, edges honed to a razor line, heavy enough to shear through helmet and bone in a single strike. When swung, they gave a deep, chopping sound, like the crack of a tree trunk splitting under the woodsman's blow. In the crush of the melee, those axes rose and fell without pause, biting into shields, splintering lances and opening the way for comrades to drive the enemy back a step, then another. When the Seljuk crescent snapped shut and the field dissolved into panic, the Varangians did not run. They formed tight around Romanos, shields braced, voices raised in guttural war cries older than the empire they served. Arrows struck and splintered against their ranks. Seljuk horsemen wheeled in close, loosing shafts, only to recoil from the brutal sweep of those axes. In the chaos, the guard became a living fortress, each man holding the line with the stubborn, unyielding pride of a warrior who knows that if he falters, the heart of an empire dies behind him. Axes rose and fell. Blood slicked the ground. But they were too few. The ring around the emperor tightened. Each step back brought them over the bodies of their own dead, their boots slipping in blood and dust. The air was thick with the stink of sweat and iron, the hiss of arrows, the scream of wounded horses. One by one, the great axes fell silent, their wielders dragged down beneath the crush, pierced from every side. When the last of the guard were gone, the Seljuk riders surged in, seizing Romanos in a tangle of arms and reins. His sword was wrenched away. A blow to the head drove him to his knees, and with that, the Emperor of the Romans was a prisoner, captured, alive. The Emperor of the Romans in Seljuk hands. Smoke hung in the air like a veil. Broken spears jutted from the earth. The dead lay twisted and unburied. Byzantines, Seljuks, horses, standard-bearers, all equal now under the Anatolian sky. Romanos Diogenes, once hailed as saviour of the Eastern Empire, now stood in chains. Wounded in the hand and face, stripped of his imperial armour, he was brought before Alp Arslan, the man whose name meant heroic lion. This moment should have been the end. In another time, in another war, a captured emperor might have been paraded through the streets, humiliated, mutilated, or simply executed. But what followed was something entirely different and strangely human. Alp Arslan ordered Romanos to be cleaned, fed, and brought before him, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. The tent was quiet. Outside, the camp stirred with victory, but inside, two men sat face to face. One, the proud, battered emperor of a dying empire. The other, the victorious sultan of a rising world. Alp Arslan looked down at his captive and asked calmly, "What would you do if you had captured me?" Romanos, bruised but defiant, replied, "Perhaps I would kill you, or parade you through Constantinople." The Sultan smiled faintly, then said, "I will do neither." And with that, the lion of the Seljuks chose mercy over spectacle. Romanos was held for just 8 days. In that time, a treaty was drawn, though fragile and destined to be broken. Byzantium would pay a ransom of 1.5 million gold pieces, followed by an annual tribute. Key fortresses in Armenia would be ceded, and Romanos would be returned to his throne. It was a gesture of honour and strategy. Alp Arslan did not want to destroy the Byzantine Empire. He wanted it weakened, fractured, useful as a buffer against more dangerous rivals further west. And perhaps in some part of his warrior's soul, he respected Romanos, a commander who had faced him in the field, blade drawn. So, in early September 1071, the emperor was released. But the worst for Romanos was still to come. Romanos returned to Constantinople, but not in triumph. He returned to betrayal. During his absence, the Ducas faction had moved quickly. News of his defeat had spread like wildfire. The court turned against him. The empress, Eudokia, refused him entry, and a puppet emperor had already been crowned. Michael VII, son of Constantine Ducas, just a boy. Romanos tried to rally support, but it was too late. He was captured, blinded by hot iron rods, a punishment reserved for emperors judged unfit to rule, and exiled to a monastery on the island of Prote. There, within a year, he died of infection and neglect. A broken man, a discarded emperor. The last soldier emperor of Byzantium gone. The Battle of Manzikert didn't just defeat a man, it shattered a myth, the myth of Byzantine invincibility. In the months that followed, the Seljuks didn't immediately storm the cities or conquer the coast. They didn't need to. The real conquest was slower and more devastating. Anatolia, the beating heart of the empire, the large peninsula that forms the westernmost part of Asia, and that today makes up the vast majority of modern-day Turkey, was left open, exposed, leaderless. Nomadic Turkish tribes began to pour in. They weren't organised armies, not yet, but they didn't need to be. They moved into the vacuum. Villages fell. Trade routes were choked. Local militias buckled. In less than a generation, Byzantine authority east of the Bosphorus had all but vanished. The emperor's lands that had once fed Rome, bred its soldiers and paid its armies, now belonged to the newcomers. In the west, the news hit like a thunderclap. An emperor defeated, captured, humiliated. The powers of Western Europe, the Pope, the Frankish kings, the lords of Normandy, saw an opportunity and a threat. If the eastern gate of Christendom could fall so easily, what of the rest? And when, in the following decades, the Byzantines, desperate and diminished, began appealing to the West for aid, the stage was set. In 1095, just 24 years after Manzikert, Pope Urban II would call for the First Crusade. And so a single battle, in a lonely corner of Armenia, sowed the seeds for one of the bloodiest, most transformational centuries in medieval history. Before our story moves on, imagine that field of battle through the eyes of a young infantryman, a boy barely grown, swept into the chaos of Manzikert and forced to face the storm that broke an empire. He was just 19, a Greek infantryman, drawn from the towns of the Aegean coast. His name lost to history, but his story not hard to imagine. He remembered the heat, the way the sun glinted off Seljuk armour, the way his boots sank in the soft dust as the archers advanced. He remembered the fear, not of death, but of the silence between arrows. That unbearable silence when you didn't know where the next one would land. He'd never seen steppe warfare before, not like this. The riders seemed to dance, one moment in sight, the next gone. They shouted in strange tongues. They moved like wind and flame. When the order to retreat came, he thought they were safe. Then he heard the horns. He remembered the moment the crescent closed, that sickening realization that they were surrounded. He watched comrades trampled, burned, skewered. The Varangians went down swinging, but there were too many. He'd survived, barely. Crawled out beneath the bodies at dusk. Hid among the reeds. Walked west for weeks with nothing but a rusted dagger and a mouthful of prayers. He never fought again. But every night until the day he died, he dreamed of arrows falling like rain. For Alp Arslan, the victory was immense. His prestige soared. He returned to his capital a hero, greeted with celebrations and solemn praise. The road to Anatolia was open. The dream of a Turkic Muslim homeland in the west was no longer fantasy. It was forming, one tribe at a time, but he would not live to see it. In 1072, just a year later, Alp Arslan was assassinated by a captured rebel leader, stabbed with a hidden dagger in the gut. He died within days, but not before giving one last order. "Let none mourn me. Let them weep instead for the man who thought he could stand against fate." Even in death, he knew the world was changing. The Seljuk victory at Manzikert wasn't just military. It was demographic. Over the next 50 years, wave after wave of Turkic tribes migrated into Anatolia, into marrying, settling, building. Arabic and Persian words began replacing Greek in village marketplaces. The call to prayer echoed from hills where church bells once rang. Turkish cavalry began to patrol old Roman roads. A new identity was forming. Not fully Seljuk, not fully Arab, something uniquely Anatolian. The seeds of a future Ottoman Empire, still centuries away, had been planted. And for the Byzantines, this was the beginning of the end. The land did not change overnight. There was no great ceremony, no line in the sand to mark the fall of one world and the rise of another. But in the quiet years that followed Manzikert, Anatolia, the ancient core of the Byzantine Empire, began to slip away. Not in flames, but in fragments. Villages switched allegiance. Garrison towns went silent. Greek-speaking farmers awoke to find the tax collectors now rode under Turkish banners. Churches stood, but the roads to them grew overgrown. And in Constantinople, the heart of the old empire, the silence was deafening. After the blinding of Romanos IV and his slow death in exile, power in the Byzantine court passed to Michael VII, a weak, bookish emperor, more at home with scrolls than swords. He presided over a fractured realm, one plagued by rebellion, famine, and inflation. Gold coinage was debased. Troops went unpaid. Governors acted like kings in their own provinces. There was no appetite for bold reconquest. The state was paralyzed, too proud to ask for help, too weak to act alone. But the Seljuks were moving. What followed wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. It was migration, slow, persistent, unstoppable. Turkic clans moved westward, not as raiders but as settlers. They brought families, livestock, tents. They built homes, planted grain, dug wells, and where resistance came, they fought with bows, sabres, and fire. New emirates sprang up across the plateau. The Sultanate of Rome, as the Turks now called it, was founded in 1077. A bitter irony, the name of the empire that once held the world, now adopted by the very people who had taken its heartland. Within 50 years, Greek-speaking Christians were no longer the majority in central Anatolia. A transformation of language, culture, and faith was underway, permanent and profound. The Byzantine Empire would endure for nearly 4 more centuries, but it would never again command the breadth, wealth, or authority it once held. It became a city-state with delusions of empire, grand architecture and hollow treasuries. Its emperors spent more time negotiating palace intrigues than leading armies. And worst of all, it lost its people's faith. Where once there was unity and purpose, now there was cynicism. The empire had failed to protect its own, failed to learn, failed to change, and the world moved on without it. In desperation, the Byzantines turned west. In 1195, Emperor Alexios I sent envoys to the Pope in Rome, pleading for military aid, not to restore lost glory, simply to survive. The Seljuks were at the gates. Anatolia, once the empire's breadbasket, was gone. Pope Urban II saw an opportunity. He stood before a crowd in Clermont, France, and called upon the knights of Christendom to take up the cross, to march east, to reclaim the Holy Land. But behind the rhetoric of Jerusalem and salvation was Manzikert, the psychological scar, the catalyst, the proof that Christendom was no longer safe within its own borders. The First Crusade would march in 1096, and with it, the bloodletting of two worlds, Latin and Greek, Christian and Muslim, would spiral for generations. History rarely moves in straight lines, but sometimes there is a break, a shattering moment where the future forks and the world stumbles down an unexpected path. Manzikert was one such break. Had Romanos held his army together, had Ducas remained loyal, had the flanking force not disappeared, had the Seljuks taken peace, the Eastern Roman Empire might have endured as a true superpower. The Crusades may never have come, the Ottomans may never have risen, the map of Europe, the Middle East, even modern Turkey itself might have looked entirely different. But that is not the story we inherited. Today, the battlefield lies silent. The town of Malazgirt, as the Turks now call it, is a modest place. No great monuments, just wind and sky and a few scattered stones. But the legacy of that place is etched deep into the soul of two civilizations. In Turkey, Manzikert is remembered as a founding myth, the moment when the Turks first took root in Anatolia. Each year, there are commemorations, reenactments. Politicians invoke its memory with pride. In the West, it is barely known. A footnote in textbooks, an obscure defeat. But for Byzantium, for Christendom, it was the beginning of the long retreat. And above it all, Mount Ararat still watches, cold, distant, ancient, bearing witness as empires rise and fall like waves crashing against stone. The Battle of Manzikert reminds us that power is not just about armies or walls or crowns. It is about cohesion, vision, trust. Byzantium had the numbers, the weapons, the history. But it lacked unity. It was undone not by the strength of its enemies, but by the weakness within. And the cost of that failure was 1,000 years of retreat. So when we look to the past, we must remember, it is not always the mightiest who survive, but those who adapt, who listen, who learn. The emperor did not, the sultan did, and history chose its victor. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.